media activist and supporter of fairness and accuracy in reporting, and the acronym stands for FAIR. He has been a source of numerous articles on media issues and a guest on Valley TV and radio. His media watch group, Arizona Media Action, AMAC, I love acronyms, helped persuade the Arizona Republic to publish the Media Beat column of FAIR founders Jeff Cohen and Norman Solomon for several years. AMAC successfully lobbied KAET TV Channel 8 to broadcast programs such as We Do the Work, Rights and Wrongs, Fear and Favor in the Newsroom, and Father Roy Inside the School of Assassins. That sounds good. Winkler served in the U.S. Army intelligence during the Vietnam era as a linguist and interrogator. He is a member of Veterans for Peace, the Arizona Institute for Peace, the Arizona Institute for Peace Education and Research, APER, and the Arizona Alliance for Peaceful Justice, AAPJ. He has a bachelor's degree in economics from Washington University in St. Louis and an MBA from Arizona State. And Dave Winkler is a part-time opinion columnist for the East Valley and Scottsdale Tribunes, where he frequently writes on issues of war, economic globalization, and the news media. And this should be very, very timely, so I'm looking forward to, I'm sure we all are, to hearing Dr. right? Just Dave Winkler.
Thank you very much for that great introduction. And I'm a peace activist in addition to being a media activist.
Right.
And let me get something out of the way first. I brought a flyer that I would like to hand out because there are 3 events. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
There are 3 events coming up. One of them is tonight. They're all peace-related events. One is tonight. It's a program called Voices of Dissent, or an evening of dissent, and we're having a documentary film called Voices of Dissent featuring a lot of notable people like Jim Hightower, Media Benjamin, Norman Solomon, and also some citizen activists who have been brutalized and wrongfully detained by the police, shot in the face with rubber bullets and that sort of thing for peacefully protesting. So we're going to show that film tonight at 5 o'clock, and we're also going to feature 2 women who, to lead the discussion afterwards, 2 women who were at the Republican convention and were preemptively detained by the New York City police and talk about their experiences. So that's tonight at 5 p.m. at the Tempe Quaker Meeting House. The address is 318 East 15th Place in Tempe, and it is on the flyer. And Friday night, next Friday at 7 p.m., I'm showing a film at Ivor House. That's the Arizona Institute for Peace Education and Research, 325 East Broadway. The film is called Preventive Warriors, and it's about the Bush national security strategy of the United States. It's this new national security strategy that says basically, if we're worried about you, we don't like what you're doing, we're going to attack you first. It's a very thoughtful documentary with a lot of experts on foreign policy, a very intellectual kind of a thing, and very important. And finally, a week from today at ASU at the law school, folk singer Holly Neer is going to be putting on a concert that's a benefit for the AAPJ, and you're all invited to that. I think it's tickets are $12 in advance, $15 at the door. They tell me she's a wonderful folk singer. I'm not familiar with her myself, but I'm looking forward to going to it. Is there anybody who could pass these out? So, it's great to be here. I love talking about the media, and I think the big turnout today suggests to me that a lot of you like talking about the media too, so I'll try to leave plenty of room for a discussion. I also brought copies of my latest Tribune column, which I want to discuss. I'll leave them up here. For those of you who are interested and don't get the Tribune, I'll leave a number of copies up here. My last column is something that I've been intending to write for a long time, and I was looking for the right opportunity, and it came along. The Tribune always puts their own titles on my columns, and the title they put on it is "Viciousness in Vietnam: Secrets of American Forces Dirty War Emerge After Decades of Silence. And one of the subtitles is the past really past? And of course, we're seeing that the past is still with us with the presidential campaign regarding the service both by President Bush and John Kerry. There were two things that I wanted to plug in this column that I wanted to share with the reader that I thought were very important. One is a book by a woman named Martha Hess. The book is called Then the Americans Came, Voices from Vietnam. And what it is first-hand accounts of what the Vietnamese call the American War from Vietnamese. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't remember ever getting an actual first-hand account of the war from the standpoint of someone in Vietnam who was opposed to our invasion. So-called objective news reports in the media would typically have a Republican and a Democrat, and in this case, both the Republicans and Democrats were behind the war for the most part. And so you might get some anti-war type people in the media. But the voices of the people over there who were actually on the receiving end of our munitions, I never heard that growing up. And I thought it's a very, very moving book, and it's a book that was almost totally ignored. And so I wanted to talk about that, and I did. And I also talked about a series by the Toledo Blade newspaper on the Tiger Force, which was a platoon in Vietnam. The series ran in the Toledo Blade newspaper last year, and this year in April it won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. And the Toledo Blade, which is a small newspaper, it's a little bit bigger than the Tribune, they had 3 journalists who devoted 8 months to this and spent God knows how many thousands of dollars. This was quite an investment for a small newspaper. And they tracked down people who had served in the Tiger Force, and they went to Vietnam to interview people who had been victims of some of the atrocities that were committed by the Tiger Force. And it won the Pulitzer Prize. Now, when the series came out in 2003, it didn't get very much news attention.
No.
And in fact, I wonder how many people have heard about that before now. That's what I see, about four or five hands. That's pretty remarkable.
Yes, it is.
It came out in 2003, and Seymour Hersh, who of course broke the My Lai massacre story many years ago, he was writing for the New Yorker, and he called attention to this series, and he wondered why there was no TV coverage of it. And so there's at that point ABC and I think McNeil Lehrer did some coverage of it, but it still hasn't received the attention it deserves. Some of the print media did pick it up and run the series, but still I think most people haven't, as this shows, and you're a very educated audience, I can tell that, but most people still haven't heard of that. So I wanted to talk about that too. And the atrocities that the Tiger Force committed were quite brutal, and I won't talk about them here. You can read them in the column. But I knew that this was going to anger people, and it did. So I'm going to read to you a letter to the editor in response, and this is what I get a lot actually in response to my columns. The East Valley Tribune is more conservative than the Republic. A lot of the people think that the Arizona Republic is a liberal paper. It isn't. Thank you. We know better, but in any event, they subscribe to the Tribune because they think it's conservative and it's more truthful than the Republic. And so this is the kind of response I get from Friday's newspaper. The title is "Winkler's Traitorous Twaddle is Shameful." Shame on the Trib for publishing the traitorous and misleading commentary of David Winkler Wednesday. His slimy piece mocks and attempts to degrade our military by inferring, he infers, I imply, but I didn't even imply, but he says by inferring that the few and far between criminal acts that actually occurred during the context of our 10-year war in Vietnam were the norm. His article is the kind of vile anti-American hate speech used by those who say our liberation of Iraq is occupation. Of course, the President of the United States says it's occupation, but he doesn't have a problem with that. And that the events perpetrated by a handful of misfits in the Iraqi prison are typical of the activity of thousands of our wonderful and heroic soldiers who risked their lives for America and in pursuit of freedom for the people of Iraq. Now these agonized liberals who hate America spew their specious lies for the purpose of destroying our faith and belief in our soldiers in Iraq, just as they poisoned America's will to be victorious in Vietnam. The minimal criminal activity that did occur in Vietnam by Americans was not typical of our actions there. That 1 million soldiers could be sullied by the actions of a tiny minority, and that horrible people like Winkler and John Kerry, who attempt to stain the reputation of America for political reasons, is disgusting and beyond contempt. So that's the opinion of Bob Ederer and Tempe, and so there you have it. So you can read my column and see what you think of it, and you don't have to agree. You may. For a change, this appeared in Wednesday's Tribune, which is the day that Marianne Jennings always appears. For a change, she's down at the bottom. It's very unusual. Normally they put her right at the top. It's very long, takes up 2/3 of the page. They'll have a cartoon with it, and she'll go on and on attacking liberals, usually without providing any foundation for its opinion. And I always like to use my columns to try to educate people, to give them resources. I plug 2 books, and also the Toledo Blade series, and one organization, so that if people want more information, they can get it. I do more. I try to educate and not just spew opinions. Marianne Jennings' column, which was at the bottom, her column was basically that the liberal brain is hardwired to act the way it does. It's in our DNA, and she used the word liberal 14 times. She used it in a very disparaging way, and it was just opinions, and I don't think it's very enlightening. And week after week to read that, I don't understand why she's as popular as she is, but she seems to be. In any event, let me proceed on. I don't want to waste any more time talking about Marianne Jennings. But I became a media activist because I liked to shed light on suppressed stories, like the Toledo Blade series, like Martha Hess's remarkable book. And because of my military intelligence background, I really dig reading about covert operations by our government that have not been exposed before. And in fact, my first column over 10 years ago was about FBI abuses of power during the Reagan-Bush era. And let me just give you some war stories. You know, I like writing about these things, and I also try to get establishment reporters and journalists and media to cover these issues. And I've had a lot of war stories, and you get kind of jaded after a while working with journalists, you know, because they just, to a great degree, I get the impression they don't give a damn. But I'll just share a few war stories, then I'll go into some media analysis and some facts and figures, and tell you where I'm coming from with respect to issues of media bias and journalism. But one of my war stories, one of my favorites, is the Tribune. After I had gained a little bit of notoriety for exposing some of the hate talk in talk radio back in the 90s, and Bruce Christian, who was a media writer for the Tribune, he's no longer there, and they didn't replace him. He came out to my house and interviewed me and Mary Richards, who were still active in the Arizona Media Action Committee. By the way, Tom Blazer, who founded it, is with us today. Tom is sitting here in the blue shirt right at the front table, and it was a wonderful organization. And thanks for all your work in founding that, and for all the work that you still do. But Bruce Christian came out to the house and interviewed me and Mary Richards. Mary, are you here today? I thought she was going to be here. So Bruce came out and talked to us. He brought a photographer out to take pictures, and I gave him some great quotes. I told him how I thought the media sort of disturbs the public in certain respects and suppresses stories. I talked about things like Project Censored, which comes out every year with a list of the top, what they consider to be censored or suppressed news stories. And I gave him some great quotes, and I thought it was going to be a dynamite article. So Bruce left, and I waited for the paper to come out with this feature story. And I waited and waited and waited, and it never came out. So finally I called Bruce Christian. I think by this time he had left the paper and was working elsewhere. And I called him and I said, whatever happened to the story you wrote? And it turns out the Tribune literally spiked it. Now, most times when a story gets suppressed, what happens is that it isn't written in the first place. Say a journalist will go to his editor and say, hey, I got this idea to do this, and the editor says no, and the journalist doesn't waste all his time and energy writing a story that's not going to get in print. In this case, it's not what happened. He actually wrote the story. It was all laid out with the photographs and ready to go, and his editor, Liz Merritt, saw it and she spiked it. And she was, I guess, appalled by the fact that we were getting some publicity. And I asked Bruce, why did she spike the column? And he said she told him that she didn't want to legitimize a group of complainers. That's, what that reminds me of is kind of the Soviet mentality. How can you complain about the news media? If you complain about the way things are, if you complain about the establishment, there must be something wrong. That really is sort of, I think, an incorporation of the Soviet mentality of Pravda or Taz or something like that. If we're living in a democracy, we ought to be able to speak out. We ought to be able to get our opinions and right out there in the news media. And she's telling me that you can't do that. If you complain, you're not worthy of being heard. That's something that I've heard before. A little background with KTAR. When we had convinced Channel 8 to run a documentary called Fear and Favor in the Newsroom. And it was a long battle. It took us a long time to get it on there. We were successful. I wrote a column about it the day it appeared. And Tony Ortega of New Times also did something on it. And it's a great film. And so it appeared, and Ted Simons of KTAR, his producer, called me, and they put me on the air that afternoon and interviewed me about it, and it was a very favorable interview, and he was looking forward to it. Nothing negative at all in the interview. And so anyway, several years go by. The war in Iraq has taken place. I was very much against it. Now he's in a different time slot. I think KTAR had changed ownership by that time, and this is not the same Ted Simon anymore. And I happened to call into his program, and I challenged him about the fact that anti-war voices were not getting a proper hearing in the broadcast media. And as a matter of fact, I had some pretty good documentation to back that up. There was an article that came out in the Washington Post, March 28 of 2003. It says, "For broadcast media, patriotism pays. Consultants tell radio TV clients that protest coverage drives off viewers." And this is the message from these hired guns. I was going to say whores, but I try to keep my tone above that of Zell Miller, But he says, this is the words of the consultant. "Get the following production pieces in the studio now. Patriotic music that makes you cry, salute, get cold chills. Go for the emotion. Air the national anthem at a specified time each day as long as the USA is at war. And don't put the anti-war protesters on because that drives people away and makes them change the channel." So anyway, I called up the Ted Simons show, and I was complaining about this, and he bullied and badgered me, and he said, "No, you're right." I accused him of, basically, I accused the broadcast media of cowardice, and he said, "You know what you're talking about." He said, "Have you ever worked in the news? Have you ever worked for a radio station?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, then you don't know what you're talking about, and you don't have a right to express an opinion." And he bullied me that way. It's the same attitude that Liz Merritt had. I think it's spiking that piece. And although I had not ever been on the payroll of a radio company, I've gotten guests for KTAR before. I've been a guest on KTAR a number of times. So to say that I had no basis for an opinion is really insulting and offensive. And so he tried, what they do, all of these talk radio hosts, even at KTAR, the big commercial hosts, they try to bully you and badger you and intimidate you and interrupt you and get you to the point where if you're saying something they disagree with, you will come around to their point of view or shut up, one of the two. And I've been on radio a lot, and I refused to let him do that. And he didn't like that. But anyway, we finished with that discussion, and we went on to a discussion about the war in Afghanistan. And I taped this because I'm calling it home, and I always tape these things. After my discussion with Ted Simons, I went back to the tape recording I had made. The station had broken in and cut off the last half of the discussion. They didn't like the way it was going. They interrupted. Ted Simons and I continued to have this conversation. I don't think even he knew that it had been interrupted. but the station cut them off because they can't take criticism like that. It's really kind of Orwellian in my opinion and kind of frightening. So those are a couple of my war stories. I'll give you another. When the baseball stadium issue was hot in the news about 1996, I think it was, maybe a little bit before, no, it was 94, I think. You know, the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors wanted to make us taxpayers pay $285 billion to finance Jerry Colangelo's Pleasure Dome down on in Central Phoenix, and for the Diamondbacks. And I was writing for The Current at that time, which was a lively little monthly publication. Tom and I worked on that and had a lot of fun and did a lot of good stuff. I wrote a cover story for The Current that talked about the relationship between County Supervisor Jim Bruner and his impending vote for the stadium tax, and its relationship to the run for Congress. And so Ferg was really happy with the piece, and he goes down to the hearing where all of the supervisors are meeting and they're going to vote. And it's a big dramatic thing. It was broadcast for 6 hours on Channel 8. And Ferd is out there. Number one, Ferd is my editor. He was taping it for The Current cable TV show. And he was handing out copies of The Current, which had my cover story on it. And he got arrested, literally arrested for handing out my newspaper. They said that you can't hand out literature in the school building. And apparently the legal loophole was that it was a private school as opposed to a public school. And they found some way to claim that he was violating the law, and they put him in handcuffs and dragged him off to jail. And it was remarkable. And eventually they dropped the charges. I mean, it was pretty outrageous. But that's another war story. And oh yeah, one more and then I'll go on to some analysis. But Channel 12. During the, last summer, after the Iraq War, the initial phase of the Iraq War was over and Bush had declared mission accomplished, MoveOn.org, and we weren't finding these weapons of mass destruction, MoveOn.org, which has been a very good activist organization, paid for an advertisement in the Arizona Republic asking for, it says, "We need the truth, not a cover-up. American men and women are dying in Iraq almost every day. We need an independent commission to determine the truth." And it has a picture of our fearless leader, George W. Bush, and some of the direct quotes from him, which were misleading to say the least, and it's called Misleader. It was the MoveOn.org's Misleader campaign. So MoveOn.org paid $20,000 and got this ad in the paper, and we held a press conference, and I was one of about 6 speakers at this press conference. And KJAS, as far as I remember, KJAS was the only media that covered it, although there may have been some coverage I didn't catch. But Channel 12 was not there. Of course, Channel 12 is owned by Gannett, as is the Arizona Republic. Channel 12 wanted to be there, so they contacted AAPJ and said, "We want to interview somebody about this." So I went down to America West Arena. They interviewed me in front of America West Arena, where coincidentally the Dixie Chicks were going to play that night. And they asked me about the Misleader campaign, and I gave a 5 or 10 minute talk to this reporter. I think his name was Rich Dubeck. I gave him a 5 or 10 minute lecture on why, number one, we thought the Iraq War was mistaken, and number two, we thought we were misled, and in democracy we need good information, and this can't happen again. We can't go to war under false pretenses again, and by golly, we need to know the truth, not a cover-up, and we need the facts. And so I laid all that out there, and it's very detailed, and I thought a very good interview. So I go home that evening and watch for it on TV, and I tape it. They had cut down that 5 or 10 minute interview to 2 sentences, literally 2 sentences, 2 very brief sound bites of me. And they found 4 people from the street who just were wandering around, downtown Phoenix, and they put them on the air. And Dubeck opens the paper and he says, "What do you think of this ad?" And he said, "Oh, this is misleading. This ad itself is misleading. What's the matter with these people?" They found 4 people to oppose me, and that was their idea of fair and balance. And even Rich Dubeck, in his treatment of it, his sort of condescending treatment of the ad and the Misleader campaign, you got the impression that there was something really wrong with me to, and MoveOn.org to want to find out the truth. So that's an example of the way, if that's fair and objective, they've got 4 guys to 1. You've got 4 people who, men and women from the street who just average people who happen to have opinions, and God bless them, but they don't give you any background at all. And they took out all of the analysis from what I had given Rich Dubeck. They took everything out there and just gave the opinions. They want heat, they want controversy, they don't want analysis, they don't want facts. And, okay, I'll do one more and then shut up. Right before the war started, in February of 2003, Colin Powell was going to the UN and saying, by God, they're going to attack us and we need UN approval right away. The Tribune Perspective page ran 2 pieces for and against the war. Here's the perspective above the fold. At the top it says a dangerous peace. Peace is dangerous. I didn't know that. I guess war is safe. Here's a peace emblem, and this peace emblem is superimposed over a picture of Saddam Hussein. And that's the big message that you get looking above the fold. Peace is dangerous. Anti-war protesters are connected with Saddam Hussein. In fact, they say that. It says effective protest is not anti-war but pro-Saddam. So those of you who oppose the war, I didn't know that, you probably didn't realize that you were pro-Saddam, but by golly. Paul Green says that you are. Paul Green is a staff columnist for the Tribune. If you look right at the bottom of the fold, you'll see this smaller print down here. It says, half-truths and lies have built U.S. policy on Iraq. That's my piece. That's the piece that they used to balance off Paul Green. And my piece was literally half the size of Paul Green's, and there were no graphics to go with it. They even took out my photograph. So people who are looking for my column, they look for my photo a lot of the time, and they don't see it. And, they say, well, Dave's not in the paper. So a lot of people that I know didn't actually know that I was published that day. So anyway, that's the kind of what I would call bias and sort of hysterical treatment that you get when the news media are acting not as objective journalists, but more as propagandists for the war effort. They sort of morph into being a mouthpiece for the Bush organization, unfortunately. But let me get into some analysis. And how am I doing on time? What time is it?
You got me pretty good stuff.
Well, let me give you some analysis, and I want to leave plenty of time for discussion. They say that journalists are people who write on the backs of advertisements, and that contains a certain really compelling truth. We tend to think of, those of us who subscribe to a newspaper, we tend to think that we're the customer, we're the consumer, and the product they deliver is the news. But there's a different way to look at it in terms of who really pays the freight, who really provides the money to these media organizations. For print media, 75 to 80% of their revenue comes from advertisers. So if you look at it in that respect, the real customers for the news organization are the advertisers. And if the advertisers are the customers, what is the product? Well, the product is you and me. The product is the people that the news organization can deliver to the advertisers. So I think it's useful to look at that and realize that these are profit-driven organizations that are there to satisfy advertisers, and they try to do journalism at the same time, some more wholeheartedly than others. So if a journalist is somebody who writes on the back of advertisements, what's an editor? Well, an editor has been described as somebody who separates the wheat from the chaff and then prints the chaff. Ben Bagdikian, who is an editor at the Washington Post and was a professor of journalism at Berkeley, he said that trying to do great journalism at the average American newspaper is like trying to play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony on a ukulele. The instrument is just way inadequate to do it, and unfortunately, I think that's probably right. The Toledo Blade did such a good job in that Tiger Force series. A lot of newspapers probably would not have bothered to invest the time and money on a story like that, as compelling as it was. One theory that you hear a lot is that news media are liberal, that journalists are liberal, and therefore there is this pervasive liberal bias in the media. And in my observation, the media have shifted to the right as the whole American public has shifted to the right over the years. And the more you have our discourse being dominated by people like Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly and these sort of bullies of the right, the more they're propagating this idea that the news media are liberal, the more that idea has taken hold, but something exactly the opposite has happened. They have such power to dominate the political discourse in this country, both on talk radio, which is dominated by conservatives, and on the cable TV networks, that they are sort of able to define terms of debate, and they have cast the news media as liberal, and it has become sort of a weapon for them. It's a way to intimidate people, to sort of warn news media organizations that if you put too many of these liberals on, we're going to go after you for bias. But let me give you some examples of what I consider to be propaganda and censorship in the news media. The classic example is the war on Iraq, the build-up to it. Just to give you some statistics, in the 2 weeks around Colin Powell's speech, where he went to the UN, the week before that and after that, 2/3 of the sources, this refers to broadcast networks, 2/3 of the sources for their news stories on Iraq were past or current government officials. It almost is like the news media became an instrument for the government. And pro-war outnumbered anti-war voices 25-1. It's just an astonishing bias against people like us. In fact, for one 2-week period, out of 267 sources on television networks, there was only one person who represented an anti-war group out of 267 people. It was just an astonishing bias in favor of institutional power and against people like us who oppose the war. Let me give you another example, Nafta. 2/3 of journalists favor Nafta, and of course that passed Congress in 1993, and almost all daily newspapers in this country endorsed Nafta. But the American people were much more skeptical. A majority of the American people did not want NAFTA to pass, or they had great doubts about it, felt they didn't know enough about it. The so-called supposedly liberal New York Times and Washington Post, for 4 months of coverage of the NAFTA issue at the height of the debate, NAFTA supporters outnumbered opponents by 3-1, and they did not have a single source who was from organized labor. Now, the point, and FAIR does a lot of studies like this, and the point is that if you want to examine whether there is bias in the media, we have this so-called system of objective journalism, which says that reporters aren't supposed to give their opinions. What they do is go out and talk to people and gather information and present multiple points of view and deliver the news to you. And so if you want to find out what bias there is, you have to look at the sources, who gets to speak and who doesn't. FAIR does a lot of studies like this, and it's remarkable that the exclusion of progressives and populists, and if you wanted to describe me politically, that's what I am. Kind of Jim Hightower is a progressive and a populist. A progressive in the sense of being liberal, populist in the sense that we challenge corporate power. It's hard to challenge corporate power when you have the news media dominated by very giant corporations. Some other examples of censorship and propaganda. In World War I, World War I was where we had the start of the modern public relations industry. Woodrow Wilson campaigned on a platform of peace. He was elected in 1916. They immediately set out to propagandize the American public to go to war. And they did that in a very short period of time, a matter of months. They formed something that's called the Creel Commission. And the object of the Creel Commission was to transform the American public to support this war. And they did so by propagating lies of atrocities committed by what they call them Huns, the German soldiers in Belgium. These Huns were going into Belgium and they were tearing the limbs off of Belgian babies and doing all sorts of atrocities. It's something we saw repeated in the first Gulf War, where we had the incubator baby stories that turned out to be false. The war on Kosovo, we had a lot of tales of death camps and rape camps and that sort of thing that turned out to be false. The evidence wasn't there. Nobody seemed to care, unfortunately, after the war was over. We didn't hear a lot about it. So I think in coverage of war, you always get that sort of bias. Other issues, the U.S. Army School of the Americas, that's an issue that's near and dear to my heart. Talk about going after terrorists. The U.S. Army School of the Americas formed in 1946. It was in Panama for many years. Manuel Noriega kicked it out. It had a very bad reputation. They were training Latin American troops in techniques of torture and repression and murder and so forth, and they were going back to their countries in Latin America, which were ruled at the time by a lot of dictators, many of whom had been through the U.S. Army School of the Americas. And they were repressing their people and committing unspeakable atrocities. So this school is in Fort Benning, Georgia now, and there's long been a campaign to close that school. And Father Roy Bourgeois, who founded the School of the Americas Watch, has spent many years in prison protesting this, and he's come to the Valley and spoken about it. So we have been, progressive activists like me have been on this issue for years. Well, in 1996, the Clinton administration released documents that actually proved the things that Father Roy Bourgeois had been saying all along, that they had manuals, training manuals that were in use in the School of the Americas that were training people in techniques of repression and false arrest and imprisonment and even murder. And when that appeared finally in the news media, it vindicated what we had been saying. The Pentagon released it on a Friday afternoon. The Arizona Republic put it in a news brief, a 4-paragraph news brief, way in the back of the newspaper on that Saturday, and it got virtually no attention. So I have many more examples of this that I could labor you with. I won't. I want to get into our discussion. Unfortunately, my opinion is that we have such a problem with mass ignorance in this country that I don't really know how to get around it. I think my goal in writing my columns is always to educate people, to give people resources where they can go to get alternative information that they may not be getting in the newspaper. And there are a lot of websites and books and magazines that I plug, and maybe you'll want to share with me some sources that you rely on. A couple, I will mention 2 of them. One is a website called commondreams.org. Commondreams.org is a progressive website. They have a lot of news from both establishment U.S. and international press and independent media, non-corporate media. It's updated every day. It's a very, very good website. Also, antiwar.com, specifically for the peace issues. This is a libertarian website, so they don't really have a political focus. It's the anti-war focus. So you get points of view from Pat Buchanan to Alexander Coburn and everybody in between. So I guess if I had to conclude my talk today, I would just leave you with the notion not to take the mass media lying down, to get active, to get on the FAIR email list, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. They send out action alerts periodically, and it causes hundreds or thousands of people to contact news organizations and challenge what we see as bias and distortion or censorship. And they do make a difference. It does have an effect. I would encourage all of you to go see the movie Outfoxed. It's a great movie. 3 people from FAIR are in it. Jeff Cohen and Peter Hart and Steve Rendell are all in it. FAIR has been working since 1986 to bring coverage to issues like this, and finally they're getting the recognition they deserve. And also, next Friday, the movie The Corporation comes out. I haven't seen it myself, but I've heard great things about it. If you want to talk about censorship, that's a good example of, and you'll see when you see the film, I'm sure you'll see that there are a lot of very compelling, important issues in this film that are not covered by mainstream media, which are dominated by giant profit-driven corporations. And so go see it and let me know what you think. My articles will be up here. It has my email address. It also has a website address for the Arizona Alliance for Peaceful Justice, in case you want to get involved. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions. Carol?
Is there a website for that fair?
Yes, it's fair.org. Fair.org. Art?
Yeah, you mentioned patriotism, and you were kind of using, quote, their definitions. I'm wondering if you could expound on patriotism and Veterans for Peace?
Yes. I think Mark Twain said that patriotism is something like loving your country and respecting your government when it deserves it. Some of us believe that the highest expression of patriotism is to dissent, and that America was founded on dissent. And if you look at the founding fathers, they were all dissenters at the time, and the country was very split when the Revolutionary War started. Maybe a third of people supported Britain, maybe a third supported independence, and the other third maybe didn't have an opinion or were interested in their own issues. And patriotism to me is not wrapping yourself in the flag, and one of the things that really offends me is when politicians of both parties feel compelled to put that American flag pin on, and then they tell you all these things that aren't true, and they tell you that they're going to send your sons and daughters off to die in a war that was unjustified and based on lies. I don't think those people are patriots. I have other words for them, but I'll spare you. And Veterans for Peace. I'm a Vietnam-era veteran. Veterans for Peace is a great organization. The membership has doubled recently, and Art's a member, I'm a member, and it's a very important voice for the anti-war movement, because we need to show that a lot of us who honorably served in the military do not support these endless wars. We don't support the idea of preventive war. We don't support the idea of subsidizing the military-industrial complex to the tune of $450 billion a year. We want to point out what sort of human resources, what sort of society's resources are being diverted to the war effort that could be used on education. I think, really, maybe George Bush ought to be sent back to school, and we ought to take some of that money that we're spending on the military and use it to educate him a little bit. He's a man who is, and this is the climate that we're living in, and it astonishes me. This is a man who admits that he doesn't read newspapers. It's bad enough that he doesn't read newspapers, but to have the, in my opinion, the stupidity to admit that you don't read newspapers to the American public, and people don't even care. Explain that to me. Yes.
Yes, FAIR did a story on NPR about the ratio of liberal and conservative commentators. Can you say something about that?
Yes, thanks for bringing that up. FAIR does a lot of studies to determine alleged bias because conservatives are always claiming that NPR and PBS have a liberal bias. Well, when you actually examine the sources, and they did that, they found that on certain programming, and I don't remember which programming they examined, that actually conservatives were outnumbering liberals, and that goes against what we're always being told. My feeling is that, again, that liberal has been turned into a dirty word, and it's being used against public broadcasting. And public broadcasting is defensive, and they think that they have to bend over backwards. And so they do that by putting more conservatives than liberals on there. I think they do very well under the circumstances. I'm a friend of Channel 8, by the way. I've had some bad experiences with KJAZ, and I'm not a financial supporter of KJAZ, but I listen to them. But I prefer to give my money to people who care about what I think, and I've never really gotten any respect from KJAZ. So, but that is an important study, and it reminds me that now with Film Warriors, it's going to be cut back to a half hour, and Tucker Carlson, this bow-tied little geek, it has a show on there now. So it's another way. When Newt Gingrich in 1994, when there was this Republican landslide, and these guys who talked about zeroing out public broadcasting came into office, there was a backlash against that because public broadcasting has a great deal of support from a wide spectrum of the American public, not just progressives, but a lot of mainstream people feel it's a really good resource and it's non-commercial, and thank God for that because I hate commercials. And it's got a lot of support, and that backfired on Gingrich and that congressional crowd, and they backed off. They stopped talking about zeroing out public broadcasting. But what they've done, I think, is try to corrupt it from within, and there are some actions to try to change the makeup of the board, and they're doing some things which I think are going to undercut the mission of public broadcasting. Yes, sir.
I disagree with you. They're not trying to corrupt Channel 8. They have completely corrupted public television, public radio. It's completely corrupted. There are no liberals anywhere on public radio. None. Zero. You're being way too kind, in other words.
Thanks. Yes, sir.
What are the definitions of liberal and conservative and who says so?
That's a good question. I don't know that I can definitively answer that, but let me give you an example of liberalism. It's called the L word. It's been turned into a dirty word. But Katrina Vanden Heuvel, writing for The Nation magazine, she wrote a piece about how John Kerry is backing away from the word liberal. And she basically is advising him to get some spine, you knucklehead, and be proud of the accomplishments of liberalism in the last century. And she lists a bunch of them. So let me rattle some of them off. These are things that were vigorously opposed by conservatives at the time. Women's suffrage, Social Security, unemployment compensation, the minimum wage, child labor laws, Head Start, food stamps, Medicare, federal housing laws barring discrimination, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, anti-pollution statutes, guaranteed student loan programs, and the 40-hour week. She writes, Senator, these victories made America a more just and open society. These programs embody the civilizing and mainstream values of the past decades, and they show how liberals have repeatedly fought for ordinary Americans. A fighting liberal would take on right-wing extremists who are determined to roll back the hard-earned rights and liberties of the 20th century. Why not stand on liberalism's proud heritage? It sure beats running away from a winning legacy. So that's not exactly a definition, but that's examples of liberalism. And
what edition of Nation?
Pardon me?
What issue or edition of Nation was
This
that?
was from the website. The date is March 15th of 2004. The title is The L Word by Katrina Vanden Heuvel. Her web column is called Editor's Cut. So hopefully you can still find it. Yeah, it's amazing how they could turn that into a dirty word, and yet in this town they erect statues to people like Barry Goldwater who voted against the Civil Rights Act. Go figure.
What
Harold?
was that website?
I'm sorry?
What was that website?
TheNation.com, TheNation.com.
You mentioned in your talking, you referred to the New York Times as supposedly liberal, I think was the term you used. Are you suggesting that we just switched, not just, but a couple of years ago, we just had it up to here with the local newspapers, and we switched to the New York Times. And you want to comment on that?
Yes.
That it's not as liberal as you think?
Yes. Well, my guess is that the New York Times is probably the best newspaper in the country. But on the other hand, just take a look at the coverage of the war in Iraq. Judith Miller was one of their main reporters on Iraq, and she was taking information from her secret source, which turned out to be Ahmad Chalabi, who was a convicted convicted of bank fraud in Jordan, and he's been on the CIA or the defense payroll for many, many years, getting millions and millions of dollars from our government. He hasn't lived in Iraq since the 1950s. So basically, she was taking the word of this crook as her main source for these articles that she wrote, saying how Saddam is an imminent threat and he's got all these terrible weapons of mass destruction. The New York Times apologized to a limited degree for that. Let me say this, the New York Times has a history of doing a lot of good journalism, but it also is a profit-driven corporation, and there are a lot of influences, such as the ownership of the New York Times and interlocking directorates. All of these big news organizations, they have the people who sit on the boards of directors go to country clubs with corporate leaders and heads of the Pentagon and government, and it's a little cliquish. And so I think that the product you get is somewhat, I would say, somewhat tainted by that. At least I think that you have to look beyond the New York Times and can't assume that they're going to do everything you need them to do. Another example, the election of 2000. Greg Palast, who is a journalist who writes for, he's an American, but he writes for, I think, the BBC and some other British publication. He talked about the scandal involving the Jeb Bush administration purging people from the voter rolls in Florida. And it was very scandalous and wasn't picked up. The story was not picked up on by the New York Times for a long, long time. And years later, they wrote an editorial about it, acknowledging that this was a bad idea and that it had happened, but they ignored that story for a long time. How did they cover the election of 2000 and the fact that Bush was appointed by the Supreme Court? Did they handle that honorably, or were they part of the this sort of landslide of opinion that was started by Fox News and George W. Bush's cousin, when Fox News called the election for George W. Bush and all the media quickly fell into line? Where were they saying, wait a minute, we don't think this is true, we think you ought to recount the whole state, and does the Supreme Court have the authority to interfere in this and tell the state of Florida what to do? Those are highly questionable things. I don't think the New York Times distinguished itself regarding that. Yes, ma'am.
I saw in the paper that at 8 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time tonight, on the Discovery Channel, the New York Times television component has a 2-hour documentary on how news is formed in the mass media. Might be interesting to watch.
What channel is that on?
The Discovery Channel.
The Discovery Channel at 8 o'clock?
Well, in Eastern Daylight Time, so what would that be, 5 or 6?
Jeannie?
Yeah, could you tell me, like, what's happening with Pacifica Radio? Is that still around, and if so, like, how widely broadcast is that? That's not here in the Phoenix area, right?
Right.
And what's happening with them?
Pacifica Radio Network is a network of independent broadcasting stations, radio, and primarily radio, and also WBAI in New York. You can hear them on the internet. The Pacifica Network was formed after World War II by people who had been pacifists and war resistors, and it was started in Berkeley. They had one station there, and then it grew to about 5 stations across the country. We don't have one here. But yes, it is still alive and active and well, and you can hear those stations on the internet. And the WBAI in New York broadcasts Democracy Now! Both on radio and television. You can get Democracy Now! It's democracynow.org. All of the programs are archived on the internet, and I highly recommend that. If people talk about liberal media who don't really know what liberal media is, this is unabashed liberal media, Democracy Now! You're getting the real thing. So I recommend that. Yeah, WBAI in New York.
It's also on Dish Network 9415.
Dish Network 9415. Is it also on DirecTV?
Yes.
It's also on DirecTV. I think it plays at 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
At Dish it plays at 9
In the morning?
and 9 at night.
The woman in the back?
The cynic and realist that I am realizes that this is all profit geared. I understand that part of it. Having said that, do you know offhand if there's been any studies done to compare or find out if the number of people coming out of the journalist degrees has increased or decreased? And does that have any?
The number of people coming out of journalism school?
Right.
I read a report recently that more and more journalism graduates are going into the field of public relations as opposed to journalism.
So they're being taught, okay, it's just that point where they're hitting a blank wall when the corporate entity says do this.
Oh yeah, I don't think the issue is, I don't know, I've never been to journalism school, I gave a talk there once, but I don't know what the curriculum is like in journalism school. I don't think that's the issue. I think that the issue is this. Let me give you an example. There are a lot of pressures to conform once you join a news organization. I grew up in the St. Louis area, and I was a big baseball Cardinals fan. And they're still my team, and they're doing great this year. But if I were a good baseball player and the New York Yankees offered me a contract, I would be there in a heartbeat. And I play my heart out for them. And I think something similar goes on. You could have a young, budding, aspiring liberal journalist who graduates from journalism school and goes to work for a large organization. But if you have a mortgage to pay for, and you've got kids to put through college, and you want a 401k and be able to retire and that sort of thing, to what extent do you get to practice your liberalism if it's going to cost you your company money, or if it's going to win you the disapproval of your bosses? There was another study. This is not by FAIR. It was maybe by Pew. I can't remember. That asked for the leanings, the political leanings of people in management positions at the big news organizations. Not the low-level beat reporters, but the people who really control policy for the larger news organizations. And only 16% of those people identified themselves as liberals. The vast majority were either centrist or conservative. So you don't really have liberals running these organizations. And the higher up you go, the more likely it is, in my opinion, that you're going to be conservative. And I think that conservatism is sort of a career strategy for some struggling journalists who really have nothing to offer the world. And forgive me for saying this, but I look at Phil Boas and McCachran in the Arizona Republic, and I wonder, why are these people there? Maybe it's a career strategy. I don't know, because I do think they're always under pressure to balance out with conservatives. So it doesn't matter, what your leanings are. I may not be a liberal, but I play one on TV. Yes, sir.
The gentleman asked you a question about the New York Times as far as their political leaning. I heard on CNBC last week that the BBC is up for sale and has asked some of the 5 major ownerships around the world to bid on them. But that was on CNBC last week.
5. That was going to be my question. How many major owners?
Well, that's disturbing.
Have you heard that at all?
No, I know they came in for a lot of flack for their Iraq war coverage, but I hadn't heard that.
I used to go to them for at least a more understandable position on different political takes outside this country, but if they're going to be bought by Murdoch or somebody, then...
Yeah, you can listen to them on KJAZ too at 6:30 every day, BBC News.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Are there any moderates in the industry, and if so, what percentage are they?
What's a moderate?
Well, you mean journalists themselves?
Yeah, what's a moderate?
Most journalists identify themselves as being centrist. In fact, I got some stats here that I will share with you.
They're fascist and...
Well, I don't, but I remember them. FAIR did a study in 1998 they sent out questionnaires to 444 journalists asking them how you describe yourself, left, right, or center, and well over 50%, first of all, on social issues, and then on economic issues. And there's a big disparity there. Most journalists, it turns out, are liberal. There is a tendency to be liberal on social issues, but not on economic issues. And that's why when journalists are described as liberal all the time, typically they're being described for their positions on social issues, not economic. But anyway, according to the survey, on social issues, well over 50% identified themselves as centrist. On economic issues, again, it's 50, 55, 60, something like that. Only 11% of journalists identified themselves as liberal on economic issues. And yet 30 or 33%, I think, identified themselves as liberal on social issues. And one of the reasons for that is, number one, journalists probably are more educated than the average American. And with that educational level, there's a correlation between that and liberalism on social issues. And also, they tend to be above average income households. And so the higher the income level, the more likely it is that you're going to be conservative on economic issues. And you're going to think NAFTA is wonderful. Well, if you're earning $25,000 in a factory and your job is being shipped to Mexico, you probably don't think NAFTA is such a great thing. Journalists don't typically worry about that stuff personally. So, yes, ma'am.
Is the foreign press similarly affected either by American corporations or by their own? They generate their own problems.
Well, let me say this. Jeff Cohen, before he started FAIR, he spent some time in Europe, and he came back saying that he was surprised how well educated some people in some of the European countries were, that they knew more about American issues than Americans did. And in some of these countries, they have very strong public broadcasting systems which have independent funding mechanisms, which ours doesn't. So there is that advantage. But then, you've got Rupert Murdoch, who reaches God knows how many billions of people with his very agenda-driven programming. So it's a mixed bag. I don't know if I can really sum it up. I never really studied it.
Not old enough.
Do you have a question?
I was just going to make the comment that Fox News has penetrated NPR. They've hired Nora Eliason, Juan Williams, and Ray Suarez. And if I hear any of those people on NPR anymore, I just wonder,
Of course.
whether their opinions have been compromised by the salaries that they get from Murdoch.
Of course
That's a
they
good
have.
point, yes.
If you appreciate the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix and would like to see more, then subscribe to our channel and check us out on Patreon. Links are in the description.